Good morning. Today, as we journey through First Chronicles, we look at chapters 4 through 6. And most of this, again, continues the genealogy, the descendants of the Israelites as they come. And chapter 40 is a lot, chapter 4, not 4D, is a lot of about Judah, Solomon and Judah's descendants. And there was one in verse 9, it says that chapter 4, Jabez was honored more than his brothers, and his mother named him Jabez, saying, because I bore him in pain. And then Jabez called on God, the God of Israel, saying, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my border, that your hand would be upon me, and you would keep me from hurt and harm. And God granted what he asked. So here, in the midst of the genealogies, the sons of and the daughters of, and so many of these names, again, I can't pronounce, and I teased yesterday that somebody should memorize chapter 4 for today. Well, I'd hate to have to look at just about any one verse in here. But anyway, there are little snippets that way. And then in verse 15, it says, that they became the father of Joab, the father of Gershom, so called because they were artisans. So we learn a little bit about some of these different ones. And there are brief mentions of some of the daughters, but mostly it's sons, because it's the sons that the name is carried on through. Like verse 23, it is listed a bunch, and it says that these were the potters and the inhabitants of Nishim and Gedera, and they lived there with the king in his service. And then it goes on and is talking about Simeon, and a lot of these are the children of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel that we're coming to. And then in verse 33, it says that, that as these were living in their villages, these were their settlements, and they kept a genealogical record. And, a lot of this, with all of the names, it would be virtually impossible, I would think, for anyone to remember it and have it completely in their heads. So they did have scrolls, and they did have some writing, and some tribes, sat down and kept their genealogy actually in written form. And I can certainly understand why. It's somewhere in a file cabinet. I have one of my cousins did a genealogy on my dad's side, and it's been quite a while since I looked through it. But there's information there about all of that, and it's written, and if it's not written down somewhere somehow, it gets lost. And then as we like at verse 34 and on, it mentions these people and says these mentioned by names were leaders in their families. They journeyed to the entrance of Kedar, where they sought pasture for their cattle, and they exterminated all of those that were there. So this is a part of the settling of the land that God had promised Israel. Some of as the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel come in, the 11 of them that got land, and then the Levites got cities and different things, because being the priestly tribe, they lived in and amongst all of the other tribes. But, so we've got a little bit of the history of the conquest of Israel tossed in here as well. Chapter 5 starts with the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel. And then it says he was firstborn, but because he defiled his father's bed, that birthright was given to the other sons. And just so Reuben is the firstborn of Israel, so then we're having, again, just continuing or looking at the 12 tribes of Israel that way, and of their settling and different things. And in verse 18 of chapter 5, it says the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh talk about the valiant wars they had, so the Gadites were the descendants of Gad, one of the sons of Israel, and we remember back as we were reading through earlier that, this Manasseh, the tribe of Manasseh split, and there was a half tribe that stayed on one side of the river, and then the other half of the tribe went onto to the other side of the river. And so right here in verse 18, it talks about a half tribe of Manasseh, and in verse 23, it talks about the half tribe of Manasseh. And as the Reubenites and the Gadites in verse 18 and the half tribe there come into this land, they capture the livestock, 50,000 of their livestock and 250,000 sheep. And, so they captured the livestock of the people that they drove out of the land, or the people that they exterminated, as in the one verse said. It still doesn't sound real good to exterminate somebody. It means the same thing as to kill them all, but I mean, it's a little bit different terminology anyway. And then verse 23, it talks about this half tribe of Manasseh living in the land. They were too numerous. And verse 25, but they transgressed against the God of their ancestors, and they were captured and driven out. And, it's just, so we have in the midst of all of the genealogy and the names, some reminders of some of the faithful ones and some of the unfaithful ones, and the consequences and that. And chapter 6 now talks more about the descendants of Levi. And Levi, the Levites, even in Jesus' day, the Levites, the Levitical tribe, were the priestly tribe. And so the chapter 6 deals a lot more with the lineage of the Levites. And they had been, my footnote, one of them said that it had been a warlike tribe, but they became the priestly tribe. And they trace it down through just these different ones, and some of the names, like Elkanah is one of the familiar names. He was the father of Samuel, if I remember right. But the priestly tribe that way. And some of the as the Levites did their priestly duties, it was during the time of David that he introduced some musical liturgy into the worship services, the Passover, the gatherings that way. And on the Sabbath day they would gather every Sabbath, just as we do every Sunday morning for worship. They would gather, and it was during David's reign then that music was introduced, and that tells about that. Starts in verse 31 of chapter 6, that these are the men whom David put in charge of the service of song in the house of the Lord after the ark came to rest there. And then starting in verse 33, then it lists those. So I mean, sometimes who they are is mentioned after their names, and sometimes like here, these are the ones that did the songs, and introduce the songs, and then the following verses some of those names are made. In verse 49, it talks about Aaron and his sons making offerings on the altar of burnt offering and doing all of the work of the most holy place to make atonement for Israel. Aaron, and within the priestly tribe, to be a priest, you needed to be a descendant of Aaron, of Levi, that way, the Levitites. But to be the high priest, especially, you had to be a descendant of Aaron. And there was the other Levitical tribes. I mean, Levi had many sons. To be a priest, you had to be one of Aaron's descendants. But to be a high priest, you had to be a descendant of Zadok, or however you say his name. So it was different scales of priests, and different, just because you were a Levite didn't mean you couldn't necessarily be high priest. And and different things that way. And as chapter 6 kind of finishes off, we're told of some of the settlements of the Levites, because within each of the areas, the 11 land masses that Israel was, well, actually 12, because the half tribe of Manasseh had 2 spots, but the Levites got some land and some cities in each area, and there were the 6 sanctuary cities as well that we haven't heard anything about those in Chronicles so far. But it just a little bit of the reminder of the settling and the different things that happened within the different tribes of the people of Israel. And, some had, they were all basically had pasture land. They had sheep, they had cattle, they had hogs, they had donkeys, they had camels. And this was their way of life. It was, they tilled the land, and they worked the land, and they cared for the ground. And so we're just kind of continuing to peruse through the history of the Israelites, knowing that God was watching, God was leading, God was blessing, and sometimes God was withholding blessings. And my prayer is that he never withholds a blessing from you. A friend that have a knee surgery replacement today, just say a prayer for successful surgery and fairly easy recovery for her. May God richly bless you today again.